Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to the podcast American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Rutger Kramer from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. He's an assistant professor of medieval history who works on Carolingians, monks, and written saints' lives or hagiographies. And he's really interested in about how people tell stories about the past and how authority flows from those stories. Thanks for joining us, Rutger.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, our pleasure. And one of the things that we do on American Medieval is that we start off with a question. And it's a silly question, so I apologize in advance. But it involves time machines. Because I think, all historians or anybody who studies the past kind of deals with the question of time machines at some point in their career, or at least thinks about them in some ways. Maybe gets asked them at a holiday party or something like that. And my question is specifically, though, is that imagine for the moment that we have a time machine. And that time machine has been presented to you, to Rutger, and with the caveat that you can only use it once and you have to go back and talk to a childhood version of yourself and tell them that someday you will grow up to be a medievalist, a medieval historian. How does young Rutger react to that news?
Well, depending on how young we're talking.
Fair enough, yeah.
With some bemused or surprised, I guess, is the...
Okay.
I just listened to Sarah Bond's episode. She wanted to be a paleontologist. That used to be my jam too. Actually, her story is quite similar to mine, except for the appellation bit. But I was always interested in history, always interested in stories. Just never thought it'd be a career. So for some reason, I thought paleontologist is a career. Then I saw Indiana Jones. So I thought I'd be an archaeologist. Then I grew up and I figured medieval history seems to be sort of the way forward. But the idea of doing something with history or with languages has always been a part of my view of myself in the future. So I wanted to be a paleontologist, which counts as history, I think. I also wanted to be a translator at some point, working on ancient history, working on medieval history. Only came at university, actually. So that's where I discovered, this is cool.
Yeah.
But storytelling and the choices that are represented by stories were always part of this. So even with the dinosaurs, I was way more interested, for example, in the drawings of dinosaurs than in the actual bone. So I was always trying to think, how did they know they looked like this? And later I discovered that even that has a long history.
Yeah.
So I probably would be more surprised at seeing my future self than about listening to my future self.
Yes, and finding out kind of all the things that you've been up to. I do love the idea, though, that medieval history, which is technically true, kind of lies somewhere between Indiana Jones fighting Nazis and the dinosaurs. So chronologically, I mean, that's actually accurate, not exactly kind of square in the middle.
Grammatically speaking, you just implied that Indiana Jones fights dinosaurs, which needs to be a movie.
That's true. Indiana fighting Nazis and the dinosaurs. So maybe Nazi riding dinosaurs. I think I actually saw a movie late night on basic cable in the United States one time in which there were dinosaur riding Nazis which needed to be fought. I'm going to have to go look that up because I think that does exist. The budget for that movie that I remember seeing was probably about $10,000. So the special effects were very poor, but I think it does exist out there somewhere. Not Indiana Jones, of course, that specific IP.
Good thing Nazis are very cheap. So that's...
Nazis are very cheap, yes. So they used to be kind of a stock enemy that everybody could agree on was bad.
Yeah.
Maybe someday in the future that will occur again. We can hope. But back to the Middle Ages. So it's interesting, too, what you said about how you took different journeys and there's different periods because, as I'm sure some of our listeners will know by now, is that when I ask that question, everybody has different ages in their mind that they're thinking of when I say kind of a childhood version, because, we all kind of have different kind of images of a kind of where that path towards adulthood kind of quote unquote begins, it always seems to be kind of some through line, some fascination with the past, sometimes with medieval history specifically, but oftentimes kind of a little bit more generally. And I love that you mentioned about the drawings of the dinosaurs rather than the bone. Kind of how do we get from that thing in the ground, which we know is, a bone. If a layman just like me is looking at a bone in the ground, I know it's a bone, to, okay, this is what a stegosaurus looks like or
Yeah.
something like that, right? And that has a long history. I mean, and that's true too, right, about how we as historians deal with our sources sometimes as well, is that you have a fragment, it's telling us a little bit of the picture, and we need to reconstruct something bigger, don't we?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like everyone complains about lack of sources, whether you're like a contemporary modern historian or someone working on ancient history, there's never enough. Even having all the modern media we have today is not enough to actually reconstruct what's happening in between. So yeah, there's always imagination. I think that's something I always try to tell my students as well, that they have to put a little bit of themselves in their analysis. And for first years, they then ask, "Oh, you mean my opinion?" And I'm like, "No, how do you imagine going from an event to a story and then going from a medieval story written on parchment to whatever we do with it?" But the imagination of drawing the lines between the nodes, I very deliberately do not say fantasy, but it does require imagination.
Yeah.
What made it click for me was an article by Carlo Ginzburg, the famous Italian historian, who compared the historian's craft to a hunter at the edge of a forest and seeing one hoof print of a deer in the mud. And then from there, he can imagine dinner.
Yeah.
He can imagine that. So it's just a single imprint in the mud. But like his entire life flows from knowing, if I follow this path, there will be food on the table tonight. There will be some mild violence in between because he's still a hunter. I keep coming back to that metaphor of thinking I'm looking at hoof prints.
Yeah, and that's a really kind of lovely way of thinking about it. I wasn't familiar with that particular anecdote, though, of course, like, Carlo Ginzburg, well-known, pre-modernist, most famous for the book The Cheese and the Worms, still available out there if you want to go grab it for our listeners. But also, too, I think that in what you were talking about kind of telling our students to put something of themselves into them, because analysis is fundamentally subjective. And subjective has kind of a bad connotation, I think, oftentimes when people outside of the profession or people outside of kind of the humanities generally kind of look at the way that we kind of do the work that we do. But just taking that metaphor of the hunter, right, is that there are many ways in order to track that deer to get towards dinner ultimately, but they'll get you there, and you need to think about what works best for you in that particular kind of situation, right? So we're still kind of trapped by this myth of objectivity, despite many historians writing about the ways that we approach the past. But I think there's something fundamentally different than, if you looked at Carolingian sources and I look at Carolingian sources, like we may arrive at kind of very similar conclusions, but we're going to take very different paths sometimes to get there, right?
Yeah. Or even worse, you take similar paths and arrive at completely different conclusions.
That does happen sometimes too. Yes.
Yeah, I think your point about subjectivity is really something kind of important in this day and age, the post-truth era, as we call it, the monster we created by embracing postmodernist approaches, the idea that facts matter as much as the presentation of the facts in a way. So it used to be easier to be a historian because you could just go through the sources and put things in order. I'm doing our 19th century forebears a great disservice. There's some good work in between there as well.
But not entirely inaccurate.
Yeah. But nowadays, again, what I tell students is that the one incontrovertible fact we have to deal with is that at some point in history, someone put quill to parchment, pen to paper, started typing. Like that's the only thing our sources really tell us. Everything else is about the choices made between the decision to write something and to actually start writing. And then you're talking about the presentation of the facts or of the events or whatever you want to call it, rather than the recording thereof, the actual happening.
Yeah.
But for some reason, this has translated, especially in the past couple decades, to this idea that, well, in that case, nothing is true. And all we have is representation, which,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have to tell you, that's not how it works.
No.
You do have to deal with the kernel of truth underpinning the choice to create sources. I call that storytelling.
Exactly. And I think that caricature of the historians as mired in kind of a postmodern morass in which the past actually is unknowable. And like that just seems oftentimes like a convenient political attack on the profession rather than anything that many historians are doing. I mean, there's always kind of outliers in which historians have made claims like that or people who study the past, but it seems to have much more to do with kind of the modern state of the university, the modern politics that we kind of find ourselves in the late 20th and early 21st century than anything that good, solid methodological scholarship would be producing.
Yeah. I mean, it also works the other way around. The amount of times I've heard politicians, whether it's in the Netherlands or the UK or the US, abuse this methodology to basically skirt around the truth and say, well, this is, it started with alternative facts and we all had a good laugh. But boy, were we ever so wrong. You sometimes, again, like one of these foundational moments in learning how to be a scholar was looking at an interview with Newt Gingrich, sorry to mention him, talking about, so here we get into a topical topic. He was talking about Gaza and the Palestinian question decades ago by now, basically saying, well, Palestine is an imagined community. And then he went on to then claim it doesn't exist. Here you could see that he knew the idea of the imagined community, which is this famous historical, sociological idea about forming a community, a sense of togetherness, despite not being able to physically and personally know everyone who is part of that community and how that is created. This is a very famous book by Benedict Anderson. I'm not sure if you've read it. It's well worth a read.
Yeah.
So it was very clear that this politician, who shall not be named, had read this book, but was using it to make political points that were almost perverse in their misreading, like deliberate misreading of what Benedict Anderson was trying to say.
Yeah.
And this happens a lot nowadays because I think imagined communities is sort of on the verge of postmodernist methodology, if I can cut many corners here.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, I've seen this more often. So I've gotten very careful about saying, the truth doesn't matter. Facts are, facts are boring, but they do matter.
In
a way, because it's so easily subverted into, but this is my truth, or, the people feel that this is the case, even though it's not true. And then I think, I've already mentioned it, the monster we created.
Yeah.
Historians of the 70s and 80s and 90s who went a bit overboard with this bear some of that responsibility, even though there are teachers in many ways.
Yeah. And I think, there's always, right, the generational turnover, right? Like we have to clean up the mess in some ways of the generations that came before us. And, I'm sure we're making our own messes, in academia right now that are hopefully, if there are historians, in the next generation that have professional jobs in the United States, at least, they will be cleaning up some of ours as well. I'm wondering too, I think, and I don't want to say that studying the medieval past is, more difficult or more problematic than any other period. But I think there are kind of particular challenges with this as well, right? In that we do have just objectively like fewer sources than our modern counterparts, for example. And then things that we study, you and I, for example, or many medievalists, not all medievalists, of course, are often entangled with religion as well, in ways that modern sources kind of often aren't. I very distinctly remember when I was in graduate school at University of California, Berkeley, that we had to take this kind of giant historiography seminar, kind of how people study the past. And it was all the graduate students of a few years kind of put together. So there were medievalists and modernists and people who studied Latin America and Africa and, Asia and places like that. And we had to kind of talk about our recent seminar paper that we did. in which I was taking a class with a colleague well at Berkeley, who shall remain nameless at the moment. But it was on early medieval diplomas or royal documents that are produced kind of in courtly settings and stuff like that. And I was saying, like, basically I had like 4 or 5 sources that I was using about this particular thing I was trying to figure out. And when I was talking about this in front of everybody else, the entire room just got quiet and looked at me. And I remember one of the professors who was teaching the seminar, who was a modernist, just looked at me and said, 4 sources? Only 4 sources? Oh my God, that's so few. How can you do anything with just 4 sources? And then everybody had a kind of a big laugh. And like my fellow medievalists and the ancient historians are just like, yeah, man, like that's what we have to do sometimes, because that's what it is.
Yeah, I supervised a student last year who was interested mostly in World War I history, so a modern historian, but he wanted to do a bit of reception history as well.
Sure.
Long story short. Disregarding what the research was actually about, we might get back to that, but we ended up figuring out that the archives, like this type of sources that he was used to working with, did not really have anything, or were still under lock and key, because it's like Greek Navy stuff. That was what we ended up working on, and it wasn't accessible.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I talked about this with him, say, how about we just go take one of the things that you did find and treat it like a medieval source, trying to figure out everything we can about this, do a bit of micro history and sort of extrapolate the world of meaning from this one newspaper article, which was a very interesting piece in a Greek, and I'm using scare quotes now, newspaper about the Ottomans and how they, in the past, the people from the East brought civilization to Greece, like the Golden Fleece. He actually mentions the Golden Fleece, but now they only bring death and destruction. So that was the gist of this article. And we sort of picked this apart, including figuring out this isn't a Greek newspaper, but it was a local newspaper from the island of Samos, which is at a literal stone's throw from the Turkish coast.
Yeah.
Written by, the student did all the work, but he figured out which journalist actually wrote it, what his deal was, and just basically got to this very interesting reflection on local responses to attempts at Greek nation building versus Ottoman actions in the early 20th century, and how this affected the local island community on Samos. So all this from a single newspaper article about Greek history, the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, but also current affairs.
Yeah.
And then I get an angry email from his professor saying, why did you only give him one source to read? And I was like, I had to sort of explain, well, it is what it is, basically. And isn't the paper good? Yeah, the paper is good, but we don't do this kind of thing. He literally wrote to me so I had to tell him, well, we totally do.
Yes. Talk about like a hoof print to dinner, right? Is that taking one little thing, and that's so rewarding. It's so exciting sometimes in our work as medievalists, but I think for, any historian, right, is to find that one source and you kind of unlock it. Right? You just kind of unlock it, and then it opens up this whole wider kind of explanation. The small world becomes really visible about everything that's kind of going on in this particular source. So it's really kind of a wonderful experience. And it's so great when you see students have that first time that they're doing it, that like you can work just with what we have available, and this is how you can do it, and do it ethically and rigorously as well.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, but I want to transition us too, because I want to talk about the stuff that you're working on, because this episode will be released in the run up to the Christmas season, and it is no coincidence that I've asked you to join us, because your work most recently has been on Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, as some people know him, but there's a messy transition between those two figures. So first of all, I think for our readers, could you just explain, like, who is Saint Nicholas?
Well, it's interesting that we're recording this 2 or 3 days, depending on how you're counting, before the Dutch Saint Nicholas feast, which we celebrate on the 5th of December, even though it's officially the 6th. Who is Saint Nicholas? That's immediately we run into problems.
Yes.
In my research, in talks, I usually try to distinguish between Nicholas, who was a historical figure. I firmly believe he was. There are some doubts about it because there are no sources, but there must have been someone. Nicholas, born in Lycia, which is present day like Western Turkey, and who became a bishop in around the year 300. So
Okay.
he was a church official in the time of Constantine the Great. There is evidence that he attended the Council of Nicaea, where the biblical canon was established and the creed was first canonized.
Yeah.
And again, I think he was, because he was a bishop. It was within
Sure.
walking distance, basically. But that's Nicholas. Then you have
Yeah.
Saint Nicholas. He was, I call him a community leader. He wasn't that big on theology from what we know. He just was a trust fund kid who started giving away his money and became, we know, like his parents
Yeah.
were stinking rich, but not greedy. Like all the texts about Nicholas make this point. They were rich, but they were good rich, not bad.
Mhm.
So Nicholas gained a reputation that made him worthy to be remembered.
Okay.
So after his death, sort of in the first half of the 4th century, I think Wikipedia says it's 343, but I don't know where that number comes
Who
from.
knows? Yeah.
But afterwards, he became someone people told stories about. And I really imagine this being a small-ish Christian community. This is the 4th century. I think the consensus is that 10 to 20% of the people were Christian at that time. So it's not a majority religion by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes, yes.
These people will come together and think about, oh, remember that time that Nicholas did this. Remember the time that Nicholas did that. And then this is what they start telling stories about. And here it becomes interesting, because remember the time that Nicholas did this or that. There actually are more saints called Nicholas from that same time and place. So all those stories end up being pulled together under the umbrella of the Bishop of Myra, which is what our Nicholas is famous for. He was the Bishop of Myra. So in the process of storytelling, and this is all oral, we have no written sources for this, Nicholas, the historical figure, turns into Saint Nicholas, the medieval saint.
Okay.
The medieval legendary figure. So I would say Nicholas is a late antique bishop. Saint Nicholas is a medieval saint who is the starting point of too many stories to count. Like, I thought about 3 years ago, oh, I'll write this one short article just to have something on Saint Nicholas. 3 years later, I'm still barely scratching the surface of what came out of that. So Saint Nicholas is the medieval saint who is the starting point of all the stories that we still have. And then at some point, and I would say basically the big pivotal point is the Reformation. So at some point between the 16th and the 19th century, Saint Nicholas turns into Santa Claus, the folk hero.
Okay.
Who still, like, there are definite links between Santa Claus stories, or in Dutch, Sinterklaas stories, but it's the same thing, and medieval narrative traditions. And here I think the Reformation is important. A central church institution controlling those stories has dropped out. So now it's just the people telling the stories. We're essentially back to the beginning.
Yeah.
But now he doesn't have to be a holy person anymore. He's just a good guy.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there's not just kind of one Saint Nicholas. There's kind of many Saint Nicholas, right? You have the historical personage, then you have kind of the oral retellings of how Nicholas is kind of immediately remembered, and then not a formal canonization process or sainthood, but then a more formal kind of consolidation of the legend, which happens in the Middle Ages. And then later on, like, it becomes kind of folk hero again, like with the decentralization of the church, kind of again, in some ways, as you said, kind of back to these late antique roots about kind of oral storytelling, kind of focused on charity and generosity and giving. Is that kind of fair? Before we even get to the United States, which is a whole other story, which we'll talk about maybe in a little bit. But
I think it's fair. I just have to maybe backtrack a little bit about sort of the central institution of the church.
Sure.
Part of what my research is showing is that there was never one consolidated Nicholas in the Middle Ages. So even there, every rewriting, every retelling of his story, every time the story gets adapted or turned into yet another manuscript or whatever, the story gets adapted to the needs of the local community.
Sure.
But in these cases, there's always a priest or someone present to check if it still fits with like a general doctrine in a way that drops away after the Reformation.
Yeah.
In this sense, I'm sort of running counter to most research on Nicholas, which is trying to get to the one consolidated Nicholas that goes back to the historical roots. And I'm embracing the postmodern approach in this sense and really saying every time someone puts quill to parchment to write the story again, it's a new Nicholas, because none of these stories is the same. And it's an insane amount of stories. It's an even bigger amount of manuscripts.
So what could account, like, because I mean, we oftentimes as medievalists, right, is that we encounter these types of saints who are incredibly popular, right? And sometimes we know that they're incredibly popular because there's lots of shrines devoted to them. There's kind of relics about them kind of all over the place. And sometimes, like, as you said, there's lots of manuscripts. There's actually like a lot of kind of written evidence. Like, do you have kind of a sense yet of what made Nicholas so popular in the Latin kind of West, right? This is what we're primarily talking about. Because there's also the Byzantine East or the Greek East as well that we need to consider. So, so was he more popular in one place than the other, or is that a chronological difference, or what was the attraction, I guess?
Well, those are different questions, and they're all $1 million questions.
This is why they pay me the big bucks. To ask these $1 million questions. So, yeah.
To maybe get the easy one out of the way first, there's a definite chronological development from East to West, from Greek to Latin.
Okay.
And in a way from Greek to Russian. So you can see him go north and west from Byzantium, from the East Roman Empire, I should say. So you can basically trace the new stories, so not the manuscript, but the new stories, the first complete saint's life about Nicholas that goes from birth to death and beyond is from the early 9th century. And from there you get like a late 9th century version in Naples. And then later you get sort of a rewriting of that life in what is now Austria, from where it gets further north to Germany. And then you get this blossoming of vernacular traditions, Old English life, Anglo-Norman life, Icelandic sagas. You can basically trace them chronologically. And the same goes for the Russian, like the tradition that goes to the northeast. Saint Nicholas is also the patron saint of Russia. He's not just Santa Claus. He's all over the place, literally.
An important political patron saint. Yeah.
So in terms of every time the first person to write a new variant of the story, we can definitely see some chronology that goes from southeast to northwest. The latest texts are from Iceland. The earliest texts are from Turkey. The manuscripts, however, complicate this infinitely. Just for one example, the late 9th century Latin text, which I've been working on the most now, so the first person to translate the Greek tradition into Latin. So there is an incomplete list of manuscripts of just that version of his life, and that's already 552 manuscripts.
Whoa. For our readers, that is a lot of medieval manuscripts of one text. That is a lot of medieval manuscripts.
Yeah, and that's just the one.
Yeah.
And the problem is, without too much trouble, I have discovered, again in air quotes, because historians don't discover things these days, manuscripts that aren't even on that list. So it's very incomplete. So first of all, they are not always recognized. So sometimes they're cataloged in the library just as saints' lives, and then you have to leaf through them to find like, oh, Nicholas is one of these saints.
Yeah.
But 9 times out of 10, the text by John the Deacon, who is the author of this earliest Latin life, has been immediately abridged. Not changed, but they've taken stuff out or reordered things ever so slightly. So it's technically, there's 552 plus copies, but there's not that many complete copies of that life. However, they do range from the 10th century to the 15th century. So while other stories were being retold, were being written down, were being developed, the old stories were still being read and copied and reused. And this is the chaos I ended up in. A lot of research has been done on the historical Nicholas in the 3rd and 4th century. A lot of research is on Santa Claus and Sinterklaas. So we have a fairly accurate picture of like the post-1500 story. But to focus on the modern Santa Claus research, most people who do that basically take it for granted that he was already a big deal when their research starts. But simply, Sinterklaas is a super important folk hero also in the Netherlands. But figuring out how his cult arrived here, why him of all saints? We have other, like Saint Martin is the obvious candidate to be the saint by excellence in our parts. But for some reason, Nicholas managed to take over. And I still don't know where to even start looking.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, y'all. As you know by now, this is the time when I tell you about another great podcast from Multitude. Wow, If True is your one-stop internet culture shop, explaining how what's happening online shapes the world. And the hosts, the internet experts and real-life besties, are the ones to unravel it. Tech culture journalist Amanda Silberling and science fiction author/attorney Isabel J. Kim Esquire. Amanda and Isabel ask the burning questions on everyone's minds. Like in one of their most recent episodes, why does ChatGPT suck so much? Because it does. Find out with new episodes every other Wednesday. Add it to your playlist now. Thanks, and now back to American Medieval. So in the John the Deacon version, which shows up all over the time, and like I love that you're pointing out is that oftentimes when medievalists are confronted with kind of manuscript copies or manuscript versions of a certain text, they're not all the same, like because individual copyists would oftentimes, or it seems very clear, like they would abridge, they would cut things out, they would move things around, they could oftentimes add things that might change the story, might not necessarily change the story, but could, substantially change the story. But they're all very clearly working from the same kind of core of a text, but as you said, kind of adapted to local conditions. But was there a core to that story that kind of derives from that earlier version of Nicholas, maybe something like the oral stories of late antiquity, about generosity and kind of gift giving that stayed the same? Or was there something kind of different within John the Deacon that seemed to make it kind of so popular as a thing to be copied? Because as you said, like medieval Europe has no shortage of saints. Right? Like there's lots of other saints that people could spend their time and their energy writing out quill to vellum at some point, but they chose Nicholas.
Yeah. So short answer, I don't know. Why him of all people? The conversion between the Greek and the Latin. So there's a technical answer, which is it's clearly John the Deacon in Naples, which is Greek at this point in time. It sort of changes hands between the Normans, the Saracens, and the Greeks. So he deals with political chaos. The stories that he gets his hands on, that he very obviously adapts or translates, are written in a very specific Byzantine, Constantinopolitan political context, without going into too much detail. But my view is that they are written in the context of iconoclasm. So this short-lived political movement of trying to rid the Christian church of images. And this Greek text, like one of the Greek texts is very overt, the other one slightly less so, but they're very clearly about sort of defending icons, but also pointing out the dangers. So very centrist in a way, but refreshingly so, I think, for medieval texts. They tend to be more black and white. The big contribution of John the Deacon's adaptation is that he sort of generalizes this. So he takes out the very specific local concerns of the audience in the East Roman Empire and makes it a bit more timeless. He's a priest, he's a canon, he works in pastoral care. So his Nicholas is subtly but slightly more concerned with being a good shepherd. That being said, his version is still very Greek in the sense that there's three core stories to Nicholas that we see from the get-go. One is him saving 3 or 6 Greek soldiers or generals, again, you may know, from being unjustly executed. Corrupt politicians accuse them in front of Constantine the Great of being corrupt. So it's like he said, she said. Constantine decides to have them executed. And Nicholas shows up to prevent this because he knows that they're actually innocent. Interestingly, in the oldest story, he runs up to the executioner and holds his sword. You see this depicted quite often. So this isn't even a miracle story. It's just him physically restraining the executioner. In others, he teleports. Sometimes he appears in a dream to Constantine and tells him. Constantine does dream a lot, it seems.
It does, yeah.
So that's one story that you see in pretty much all the versions of his life. Then there is a story of him helping sailors.
Okay.
Very briefly, there's a storm at sea. Sailors invoke the help of Saint Nicholas, who in some versions is still alive and teleports to the ship. Other times he appears. Most medieval saints would then quell the storm, make sure that the sea become peaceful again. Here we get descriptions of Nicholas helping them. So he tugs on the ropes and hoists the mainsails and battens the hatches.
So teleporting and helping, those are the themes so far. Okay, yeah.
And then the big one is basically him secretly giving gold to 3 girls whose family have fallen onto hard times and their father wants to turn them into sex workers. I'm not sure what he wants to do is not nice. So he wants to basically employ them in a brothel.
Not Nicholas employing them at a brothel.
No, the father. The father.
Yeah. Just want to be clear. Yeah.
And then Nicholas secretly throws gold through the window. And we can talk about this some more, but just the short version is that then thereby they are saved from a life as a prostitute and they can get married and have like a normal life.
Yeah.
And those 3 stories are still visible, at least in the European Santa Claus variants. Like the American Santa Claus is a bit different, but he's still associated with ships. He's always been the patron saint of merchants and of children. The secret Santa goes back straight to this story of him secretly giving gold.
Yeah.
And also he always had a bit of an anti-authoritarian streak.
Yeah.
He cooperates with authority, but to make sure that authorities do their job well. There's several other such stories where the miracle is basically him working the system rather than doing something supernatural. And again, working the system can be quite supernatural in some cases.
Yeah, and that does seem to be a theme, right? Is that so the people of those 3 stories, right, is that soldiers, maybe if they're generals, but if they're just kind of generally soldiers, sailors, and then vulnerable young women, those are the types of people that he's looking out for. It is entirely within the authority of an emperor to execute soldiers, right, who are disobedient. It is entirely normal for sailors to face bad weather. And it is in late antiquity, like entirely, not necessarily normal, but like these are things that happened, is that fathers controlled the lives of their young daughters and they could do kind of what they will. But Nicholas seems to be looking out for those people who are being kind of unjustly, if not illegally, being forced into these difficult situations. Is that kind of fair?
Yes, although there's always an although to these sort of things.
Of course, yeah.
Interestingly, for example, the story of him giving gold to the girls, that's usually how it's told. He secretly gives gold to 3 girls. In pretty much every version, it's very clear that he gives the gold to their father as a dowry.
Oh.
So the girls don't get a voice. They're not named. They have no agency at all. So it's just depending on which version you read, the author is more or less sympathetic. There's an old French version where at this point the author addresses the reader, say, you can imagine that it was a sad occasion when they prepare to go to the brothel for the first time. So he draws on the heartstrings of the reader.
Yeah.
The Greek version is way more neutral. It's just like, yeah, that's happened. As you said, like daughters have no choice in this. And then they get married, which is fine. The problem that Nicholas acts against is not so much the cruelty against the children, in this version, I should say, in the earliest.
Yeah.
And more about the fact that this is upsetting the social order. It's very clear that this is a formerly noble family that has fallen on hard times.
Oh, okay.
He restores them. No worthy man wanted to marry them because they're poor. That's the problem.
So it's the lack of the dowry that's the issue.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And to go back to your original question, John the Deacon's retelling of this story doesn't change that too much. So it's still, the girls have no agency. It's still about the dowry. It's still about Well, he sort of makes it more about that prostitution is a bad thing rather than being poor. So, I mean,
Sure.
do with that what you will. But he does add, in the longest version, there's a little digression added at the end where he addresses the reader in the form of the Father, if that makes sense. So he basically adds a little prayer saying, by the way, this is God helping these girls through the agency of Nicholas. But of course, this father should have just gotten off his ass and started doing a job. Just mention this.
Yeah.
This is a story that in many manuscripts, or this is an edition that in manuscript it's taken out again. But at least John the Deacon makes it a bit more about, in a way that speaks to more people than just the top elite who would be like, oh yes, no, I would never marry a poor woman. Now suddenly it's also about, hey, you can make your own fate.
Yeah.
Because just to close the loop, if that makes sense, it's not a miracle. Again, this isn't a miracle story. It's just Nicholas, the child of very rich parents, giving money. That's the miracle.
Yeah.
By American standards, it's probably miraculous that rich people just give their money away.
I was going to say, I mean, that a wealthy, powerful person would risk themselves to help people who are less fortunate to them. So, I mean, miracles for our own time, perhaps.
Yes.
So,
But there's no divine intervention. There's no smiting. There's no miraculous appearance of gold. It's just literally him taking his own money and giving it to poor people.
yes.
And we can talk for ages about the many different reasons why he does that. In some versions, it's about the reputation of the family. Sometimes it's because they're hungry. Sometimes it's because prostitution is a sin. So he's leading the daughters into sin, this father.
Yeah.
In the end, it's Nicholas doing the right thing. We can debate whether or not he does it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
But the core is that it's Nicholas doing the right thing. Saint Nicholas has an agenda. Nicholas does not.
Yeah.
Santa Claus just gives gifts as a reward for good behavior and or to prevent you from sinning in the future. And so here we can see how this tripartite historical development kind of works in action.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, like in the John the Deacon story, like as opposed to some other kind of hagiographies or saints' lives, right, is where the supernatural is much more visible in other saints' lives. And here it seems, if I'm understanding correctly, and I'm sure there's lots more right to the text, which we're leaving out in our discussion right now, but it's God kind of working through Nicholas just through good behavior in order to, as you said, kind of right the social order. Like things are out of whack and people in power to actually do something, the father, the emperor, in those two cases, are not doing kind of the right thing. And so Nicholas has to intervene.
Yeah. The later we get, the wilder they get. And there,
of course,
many famous stories about Nicholas are from later traditions, which are actual supernatural miracles. But the very earliest stories are all stories that you can tell people, you could do this.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a millionaire, but you can help your neighbor. You don't have to be a bishop, but you can be a witness in a case or something.
Yeah.
He is relatable. He can be imitated in a way that you cannot imitate someone who shoots lightning out of their fingers or something. And so he's, in that sense, I would say more Captain America than Thor, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah.
So if everyone could get the serum and become Captain America, but like there's only one Hulk, there's only one Thor. Like in terms of superheroes, he's the relatable guy. Yeah,
he's the relatable guy. Yeah, so, which may account for some of that popularity.
I guess he's Batman, actually. Now that I think of it.
Oh, Batman. Oh, there you go. Okay,
he's,
all right.
He's rich.
So.
He does on occasion beat people up in later stories, so it kind of fits.
I mean, Bruce Wayne, notable philanthropist, I think, in the stories as well. Like, lots of charitable giving too. So, okay, so Saint Nicholas as Batman, I think that's the one we'll go to.
Yeah.
So, how does this transition to? Because I want to get us towards modernity, even though this is kind of a show about the Middle Ages, American medieval. How does it get to kind of Sinterklaas? Right, like in the Dutch version, in which it's more kind of a folk hero there, which I know that this is a huge question. But in, for example, like specifically in the Netherlands, maybe you could first explain kind of like what is Sinterklaas to the Netherlands kind of in the early modern and the modern period? And then maybe we can try to transition to Santa eventually.
Oof. Okay. So
just a small question for the next, 5 minutes. So
again, I will keep calling him a folk hero.
Yeah.
He's kind of a weird phenomenon. He's a very coded Catholic bishop in a predominantly secularized country where Catholicism was banned for 3 centuries. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, he's really there to give gifts to children as a reward for having been nice. So this is a shift that you see. The medieval Saint Nicholas gives gifts so that you will behave.
Sure.
Modern Sinterklaas give gifts as a reward. Every year at the start of November, he arrives via steamship from his palace in Madrid. Don't ask how he got there, but Sinterklaas lives in Spain. He arrives via steamship, and this is a televised event every year with a large run-up. Weird adventures always happen. Sometimes the ship sinks or they lose the key to the vault where the gifts are hidden. By they, I mean his servants, who are problematic in their own little way. Shenanigans ensue, and at the end, Nicholas solves it, usually not through miraculous means, but by just using his brain. And he's like, actually, we can solve it like this. And then the gifts get distributed. We celebrate this. Officially, you're supposed to celebrate it on the 5th of December by singing and then hanging your stockings or putting your shoe out. And then on the 6th of December, they will be filled with gifts. Nowadays, we usually give the gifts on the 5th of December, just so you don't have to deal with impatient children. So that's Sinterklaas as he is now.
Sure.
This comes from this specific children's feast existed already in the 16th century and the 17th century. There's indications that he was already a folk hero then. Purely through existing. He's being mentioned because we know Protestant Calvinist preachers saying, we've gotten rid of all the saints, but we cannot get rid of Nicholas. He's in our world. Like, why don't people want to give him up as well? Which is interesting. Yeah. So he's always there in the background. There's laws, Dutch laws, banning his celebration, but they get rescinded quite soon because apparently there's an outcry against this. So he's the last one standing. And by the 19th century, in this weird period where you get the combination between romanticism and this rational way of raising children, that's what I think is going on. He becomes this boogeyman figure, gets reinvented again as a sort of person who gives rewards and or punishments. And that's where we slowly get to the modern Nicholas, who doesn't punish anymore. You can scare children with it, but they all know, like, no one's going to. So the official punishment is that either you get beaten with a stick or you get abducted and taken back to Spain to become one of the servants of Nicholas.
In the American tradition, it's usually you just get like a lump of coal in your stockings rather than being abducted and forced into slave labor. That's a little bit more troubling. It is super interesting, though, going back to kind of what you mentioned is about Calvinist preachers, which, if you know anything about kind of early modernity or kind of Calvinism generally, like not big fans of the saints generally, kind of as you mentioned, but something about him already is just like, we have to keep him.
No, they want to get rid of him. The preachers.
Oh, okay.
So we know about the persistence of the tradition because there's sermons against it.
Oh, okay. So they are indeed preaching against kind of, but it's too embedded within kind of the culture. Is that what you're saying then? Okay.
And this is work that I still need to do extensively. But here we can see, actually, I think he's kind of being saved by the fact that he gets dislodged from his church connection. Because if he were still like a full-on holy representative of the Catholic Church, it would have been easier to get rid of him.
I wonder if it has something to do too, right, with the types of miracles that we were just talking about, right? Because there isn't that kind of supernatural, or from a Calvinist perspective, right, scare quotes around it, superstition, right, about the activities that he's doing. He's just kind of like, he's there, he's a helpful person for the people, he's a generous kind of patron and things of that nature.
Yeah, although again, like by the 1500s, there are really outrageous stories about him as well.
Sure.
The most well-known one, which is depicted everywhere in the Netherlands, is where he resurrects 3 young children
Oh.
who have been slaughtered by a butcher during a famine. In the medieval traditions, these are pilgrims, students, or merchants, but they, in the early modern period, turn into children.
Okay.
And they get sort of Sweeney Todded, turned into mincemeat.
Yeah.
The worst version actually has them being turned into sausages and put on salt for 7 years. And then Nicholas shows up and resurrects them. So think about being a sausage for 7 years and then being resurrected. Like, what the hell?
My mouth is agape right now. So I have to describe that to our podcast listeners. But like, wow, sausage for 7 years and then he resurrects them. That's a heck of a miracle right there.
Yeah. So this is beyond simply, oh, someone dies and you resurrect them straight away. Like, this is really outrageously supernatural.
Yes.
Which, in a way, and I still have to think about this because I haven't found the first instance of this story yet. I know it's early modern of the children's story, but in a way, it's so outrageous that also makes him relatable.
Okay.
In a way, I can imagine. So there's a story about Saint Martin resurrecting someone, but it's like a person is sick and apparently dies, and then Saint Martin prays over him, and it's actually described that he prays into his mouth and then the person resurrects again. So all the rationalists are saying, oh, he inadvertently gave him
CPR or something.
But that's in a way more alienating, I think, than like something as outrageous as children literally being turned into mincemeat or pilgrims or whatever.
Yeah.
There's one story where he doesn't help the ship by tugging on ropes, but where he flies over and lifts it out of the sea by the mast, which is so outrageous that it makes him more accessible. Because at that point, I can imagine the average listener thinking, okay, well, imitation goes out the window. So in terms of superheroes, now he's Superman.
Yeah, just like a power beyond kind of imagining there.
Yeah. So though, again, you don't have to relate to him. So he doesn't operate between those extremes. He operates at the extreme. So either he's very relatable and imitatable, or he is like the most out there saint of them all.
Yeah, and there's something kind of attractive about that, right? So almost like, I mean, Superman, again, we're staying with kind of the superheroes thing, right? Like Clark Kent, the kind of most normal guy you can kind of imagine, kind of a bumbling fool in some ways, and then, or Superman, like this all-powerful God figure, or just like an all-powerful figure who can do these monumental things that are beyond our imagination.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said there. I don't think, like, it's always clear that Nicholas isn't just Clark Kent. Like, he's always portrayed as a model millionaire.
Sure.
But otherwise, your point stands.
So, this figure of Sinterklaas, right? And as my understanding is, and this is kind of outside of both of our scopes, but about the transition to the Americas, my understanding, right, is that it was Dutch colonists, Dutch immigrants into specifically kind of New York City or the New York area where there was a lot of Dutch settlement initially that kind of brought this tradition with them. And then it becomes kind of Americanized in super weird ways in the 18th and 19th centuries. Is that kind of fair, or is this, I mean, it's just, I'm sure, a terrible oversimplification, but.
Well, I think as far as I've been able to ascertain, this must have happened, but we don't know. And by we, I mean smarter people than I who have actually worked on this. Dutch immigrants arrived way before the earliest American sources dealing specifically with St. Nicholas.
Yes.
I think the earliest source where he's mentioned or where his feast is mentioned is 1733. But of course, he must have been there earlier.
Sure.
We don't know.
Yeah.
The big jump to Santa Claus happens in New York because everything happens in New York for some reason. It gets really chaotic, but there's someone who's usually credited with this is a guy called John Pintard.
Okay.
Or Jean Pintard, I think I should say. He comes from a French background. So he's one of the founding members of the American St. Nicholas Society.
I had no idea such a thing existed.
In 1810. It still exists, apparently. Again, he's from a French background, and there's letters of him by him to his daughter basically saying evangelicals don't know how to party, so let's show them a good party. It's a bit more subtle than that, but that's the gist of it. So he starts making, and it's kind of an elite old boys club, the St. Nicholas Society, just having dinners on St. Nicholas Day because he is a Dutch saint. So this group makes a lot of his Dutch heritage Also, with the help of someone that many of your listeners may know, Washington Irving, writer of Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He also writes The History of New York, I think he writes, and that's chock full of St. Nicholas. So this is 1830s off the top of my head. And it's hilarious. He starts, so the first Dutch colonists arrive on a ship called Our Lady with a statue on the bow of St. Nicholas, and he guides them to Manhattan Island where they found New York or New Amsterdam at that point. And he keeps getting back to St. Nicholas being the inspiration behind everything these Dutch colonists do. So Peter Stuyvesant was inspired by St. Nicholas and so forth and so on. And that's really weird to read. I didn't know this when I started it, but it's almost medieval in its weirdness that you think, wow, this is less than 200 years old and I don't get why.
Yeah.
But between those two, and then there is, of course, The Night Before Christmas poem, which is also roughly that time.
Famous poem, yep.
You can see that there's sort of, on the one hand, this transition towards a Dutch Saint Nicholas. So there's three things happening. Sorry to be a bit long-winded about this. So
No.
you have this weird group related to Tammany Hall. I should have mentioned that. So ultra-nationalist, anti-everything conservatives. At least that's how they are in the Gangs of New York movie. I'm not sure how historically correct that is.
Yeah.
But they are at the foundation of this Nicholas Society, this group. And what they want is American saints. So Tammany Hall is at some point also called Saint Tammany Hall. Their members are called saints. Tammany is like a Native American name. But their point is that, okay, we don't want like any weird Italian or Irish influences, the Catholics. No, we want like proper Dutch saints. So that's what they look for. And Nicholas is the one, the last one standing. So he seems a safe bet. So that's one thing. Then you have the fact that there are immigrants who do take their own traditions with them. So
sure, of course.
It's not like this St. Nicholas Society went to the Netherlands to see how it's done. They took a known property and appropriated that. But then at some point between this foundation of the society and, let's say, the mid-19th century, the night before Christmas, not the lovely film The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yeah.
The people, so not this old boys club, but the people decide that it's too weird, is what I think. It's too strange to celebrate this Catholic saint.
Yeah.
So he gets folded into the also existing Father Christmas tradition, which is English. There's a bit of Kris Kringle in there as well, which comes from Germany. It's a Christkindl, again, a Christmas tradition. So Nicholas gets absorbed into the Father Christmas traditions, meaning that essentially Father Christmas is usually dressed like the original Father Christmas is dressed in browns and greens. He's more of a trapper in a way.
Okay.
And his clothes just get the color of St. Nicholas's mantle, which is bright red.
Yeah.
And there you have Santa Claus. That's really the shortest way of explaining it. But it's this weird conjunction, of like ultra-nationalist Americans and kind of progressive folk histories. Because again, why Nicholas? Because he stands up for the oppressed. The original Nicholas would probably look at Tammany Hall and think, nope, I don't want anything to do. But out of that comes this strange figure that is part Catholic saint, part folk hero, all marketing, basically.
Yeah, a super weird mixture of traditions, as we were saying, like, because I think that Americans tend, especially now, right, like we don't think about kind of the history of these figures, is that, as you mentioned, Kris Kringle, Father Christmas, St. Nicholas, kind of Santa Claus as kind of one thing, that they're all like exactly the same thing, but it is very clearly, as you're saying, I think kind of, if you look at the different strands in the histories of these things, a bunch of things that kind of came together, immigrant communities bringing their own traditions and making something kind of distinctly different and American with some political corruption thrown in along the way, because it's America, and that's kind of how we work.
Yeah, and it's also the 19th century. It's
also the 19th century, which is filled with that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah.
but I think unfortunately, we're running out of time here. So I think we have to end it there. I mean, not with political corruption, but with this weird mixture of different traditions coming together to make something distinctly American. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been a tour de force. I mean, I think we could probably continue this conversation for another hour. So maybe we'll have to have you back on the show at some point. But thank you again, Rutger, for joining us. If people want to learn more about you or your research or anything like that on the internet, how might they find you?
So there's, roughly speaking, two ways. You can just put me in your favorite search engine of choice. And if you add the letters UU after that, you get to my university homepage, which has all the information. I am on one social medium, which is Bluesky, where I am at another aspirin. Don't ask where that name came from. Where I post occasionally. I used to be very active on social media, but I don't have time anymore. So, and I post Nicholas pictures there, so you can come and hang out.
Go find some Nicholas pictures. Absolutely. Yeah. So please go find Rutger and find out more about his work. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to all of our listeners for joining us on another episode of American Medieval. We'll see you all hopefully next week. Take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schifini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/AmericanMedieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.